The greatest crime is not developing your potential. When you do what you do best, you are helping not only yourself, but the world. Roger Williams.
Oh, hi! Mr. Lahasky here. And today we get to learn about wholesome pilgrims, bountiful Thanksgivings, and brotherhood and harmony between Native Americans and Europeans. Actually, no. That's the sanitized version of the New England colonies. You're getting the real thing. Public humiliation, death by stoning, religious fanaticism, and war. The New England region of the British colonies was settled only a few years after Jamestown, but the colonies that emerged there were markedly different than their southern counterparts. As we learn about the settling of New England, make note of the similarities and differences between the Chesapeake and New England colonies. Patterns will emerge that help us to understand modern America. To begin, let's ask a big question. Does a close relationship between church and state lead to a more moral society? The separation of government and religion in the United States has long been a characteristic of American democracy. But throughout history and even in recent decades, some Christians in the United States have argued against that separation, suggesting that the abandonment of religion in public spheres has spurred a degradation of American morality. While it's hard to say whether or not this argument holds water, we can look to history for some answers. The early New England colonies, in particular Massachusetts, give us insight into what religious governance looks like on American soil. Was it a model for success? For morality? Let's find out. The New England region is the northernmost region of the 13 original British colonies. It includes Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire. When we discuss the Chesapeake, we used Virginia as our case study. For the New England region, our case study is Massachusetts. So I say New England, you think Massachusetts. Massachusetts was the first New England colony and will become the busiest. In the mid-1700s, Massachusetts will become the cradle of the American Revolution and a great bane of the British Crown. But we still have a ways to go before we start talking revolution, so let's back up and start at the beginning. Here's our first big idea. New England settlers were motivated mainly by religious factors, namely the desire to establish a Puritan society free from religious persecution. We learned that in the Chesapeake, profit was the principal motivator for colonization. The colonists in Virginia saw economic opportunity that they lacked in Europe. In Massachusetts, however, religion provided the main motivation for colonization. And to understand how, we need to quickly revisit the Protestant Reformation and the rise of the English Puritans. You may remember from your world or European history class that the Puritans were Calvinists living in England. Calvinism was a branch of Protestant Christianity whose defining feature was the doctrine of predestination, the belief that one's soul was preordained for heaven or hell upon their birth. England faced religious unrest through much of the 1500s as the Church of England oscillated between Catholic and Protestant influences. Queen Elizabeth finally established a measure of stability by compromising between the two, but the Calvinists in England were yet unsatisfied. They wanted to purify the Church of England by removing all of its Catholic elements, hence their name, the Puritans. Many Puritans remained in England, advocating for further reform of the Anglican Church, but others believed that the Church was beyond reproach and endeavored to seek religious refuge elsewhere. These were known as the Separatists. You know them as the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims left England and landed in Holland, but relocated again because they feared Dutch culture would corrupt their society. In 1620, they set sail for the New World. The Puritans aboard the Mayflower had intended to land in northern Virginia. Virginia was the only British colony at the time. But they were blown off course and instead made landfall at Plymouth Rock. The area had not yet been claimed by the British government, so technically the laws of England did not yet apply to the Pilgrims' new home. The passengers aboard the Mayflower recognized that a lawless society might descend into chaos. So while they awaited an official charter from England, they drew up a historic document, the Mayflower Compact. Before setting foot on American soil, leaders aboard the Mayflower drew up a compact or agreement. In short, the document stated that the colonists would establish their own laws, that they would agree to those laws, and that they would adhere to those laws. This was a seismic moment in colonial history, as it represents one of the first notions of self-government in the British colonies.
Some historians suggest that the Mayflower Compact even provided inspiration for the Declaration of Independence over 150 years later.
Now, as was the case in Virginia, the geography of Massachusetts made life difficult for the colony at Plymouth. Nearly half of the 102 passengers died during the first winter. But Pilgrims managed to secure a foothold in Massachusetts, inspiring more Puritans to follow them to the New World. This brings us to our second big idea. The Puritan beliefs of Massachusetts settlers shaped colonial society there. The Plymouth colony was a modest success, but soon Massachusetts grew into a bona fide Puritan refuge. In 1629, the joint stock Massachusetts Bay Company launched an effort that would bring more than 20,000 settlers to Massachusetts over the next 10 years. Remember, joint stock companies were all the rage in England at the time, and this one was led by Puritans who aimed to establish a model Calvinist society. The Massachusetts Bay Company named John Winthrop the colony's first governor. And Winthrop made it clear that he envisioned a society in which the Puritan faith would permeate daily life. In his first major speech as governor, a sermon entitled A Model of Christian Charity, Winthrop outlined the beliefs on which Massachusetts was eventually built. Winthrop emphasized the need for community and cooperation in Massachusetts. And this was evident in the colonial society that emerged. Unlike Virginia and the southern colonies, communities in Massachusetts were very close-knit and a central part of daily life. Because Massachusetts was a place of religious refuge for the Puritans, women and families were common. Homes were built close together and often surrounded a school and a church. The community-first mentality was indeed present to an extreme. Individualism was frowned upon. Colonists dressed alike in plain, modest clothing, and communities policed themselves. You see, Winthrop envisioned Puritan society as a city upon a hill, a model for nations around the world. Puritans believed that theirs was the truest form of Christianity, and recognizing that their Puritan experiment would unfold under a microscope, they went to great lengths to ensure the piety of their communities. Massachusetts communities were governed by elected leaders, but only established church members who underwent a strict religious screening process enjoyed the right to vote. The laws passed in these assemblies suggest a close relationship between church and state, if not an outright theocracy. Church attendance was mandatory. Dress codes were enforced. Sexual norms outside of marriage were regulated, and even dance was restricted. When the rules were broken, justice was swift and often public. Public punishment was used for both minor and major infractions. Missing church, for example, could earn you several hours of being chained up in the public square. In some communities, adulterers were forced to display a badge on their clothing at all times, identifying their sin. In other communities, the offenders were hanged. The public aspect of these sentences served two purposes. First, it sent a message to other community members. Don't fall out of line or you'll end up like this guy. Second, it reinforced the community-first mindset, for the shame of the community was a form of punishment second only to death. John Winthrop concluded his sermon and his vision by suggesting that the colonists would receive feedback directly from God. He remarked that if settlers lived righteously in the eyes of God, he would reward their city with prosperity, so that it might shine as an example for the world. If, however, the colonists faltered in their faith, God would see them ruined. This tenet is known as covenant theology, and it became a defining feature of Puritan life. The belief had obvious effects on religious practices, but it was evident elsewhere in the colonies as well. One thing you would definitely notice in a colonial Massachusetts community is that the Puritans worked hard. In the minds of these settlers, economic prosperity was a sign that they were living piously. So in order to demonstrate to themselves and their community that God was satisfied with them, they worked extra hard to achieve it. This cultural phenomenon is known as the Puritan or Protestant work ethic, and sociologists suggest that it still exists today. The Pew Research Center found in 2019 that of 41 industrialized countries, the United States was the only one that does not require paid parental leave. On top of that, American workers elected not to take 768 million paid vacation days in 2018, essentially donating these hours back to their employers. Globally, the American worker ranks second, behind only India, in total number of hours worked per year. A number of explanations for these trends have been offered, including increased competition for top jobs, but historians suggest that this may be a cultural trait that dates back to America's Puritan roots and the Protestant work ethic. It was ingrained in American society long before the United States was even a nation. As Massachusetts developed, many of Winthrop's ideals were indeed realized, but not everyone in the colonies fit that mold, and Massachusetts had its share of dissenters and outsiders. For these settlers, results were mixed. This is our third big idea. Dissenters and outsiders in Massachusetts were often rejected by the colony, but some found refuge in other parts of New England. No matter what way you look at it, the strict Puritan lifestyle was not for everyone. The Puritan churches and governments in Massachusetts were met with a number of challenges and challengers. Roger Williams was one such colonist. Williams was a Puritan, but also a philosopher of the Enlightenment. In particular, Williams had strong views on the separation of church and state, as well as religious toleration. But these tenets went against the theocratic governments in Massachusetts, and Williams was banished from the colony. With the help of natives of the Narragansett tribe, Williams was able to establish a refuge from Puritan life in a place he named Providence. There, he established a new colony, Rhode Island. Rhode Island became a landing site for many Puritans who couldn't quite hack it in Massachusetts. Anne Hutchinson was another famous dissenter in Massachusetts. Hutchinson became an influential preacher, but her rise alarmed church elders who did not believe women should hold such roles. Her ideas challenged gender roles in the colonies, and she even questioned the doctrine of predestination. Like Williams, Hutchinson was tried for heresy and banished from Massachusetts. After she joined Williams in Rhode Island, Massachusetts church leaders purged local governments of anyone who had once followed Hutchinson. Here's a quick video that traces the descent of Hutchinson and Williams, as well as one of the most controversial developments in colonial Massachusetts, the Salem witch trials.
The Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded by Puritan English settlers in 1628. Their land grant was sponsored by the Massachusetts Bay Company and stretched from present-day Boston up to southern New Hampshire and over to western Massachusetts. These colonists were devout followers of Puritan Christianity. They implemented a theocracy, which means a religious government. Their intention was to create a strong, godly community, but the consequences of theocracy were devastating. The Puritan story inspires us to ask, how did such pure intentions drive a community into mass hysteria and result in the events that community leaders would ultimately profoundly regret? John Winthrop was the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and a renowned English lawyer. He called his vision of the Puritan society a city upon a hill. Because Puritans enacted a theocratic government, town life was centered around meeting houses. At these meeting houses, the community would gather for prayer services and hold town meetings to vote for representatives or make other political decisions. Not long after settlement, it became clear that certain members of the community were not willing to submit to the restrictions of Puritan law. Roger Williams, a well-known theologian and scholar, was one of these individuals. Williams believed strongly in the tenets of a separated church and government, as well as religious freedom. This, of course, did not sit well with Puritan leaders, and in 1636 Williams fled the colony and founded Providence Plantation, which would eventually become Rhode Island. Anne Hutchinson, who was a student of Roger Williams, was another famous dissenter. In 1637, Hutchinson was put on trial for contempt and sedition. She defended herself forcefully, but inevitably she was convicted and banished. She followed Roger Williams to Rhode Island. By the late 1600s, the situation in the colony had reached a fever pitch. When a young girl named Abigail Williams and a group of her friends began to complain of odd pains and suffer from strange neurological fits, the townspeople believed that witchcraft was to blame. 3 women were held accountable: Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and a native slave named Tituba. Coincidentally, all 3 of these women were considered either outsiders or dissenters by the people of the village. The fear of witchcraft spread like wildfire, and suddenly allegations of black magic began to spring up everywhere. Over an 18-month period between 1692 and 1693, accusations of witchcraft were leveled at countless different people. Of all of those accused, 20 were executed by hanging, except for one man who was crushed to death with stones. In later years, those who conducted these trials and condemned the supposed witches to death would express regret for their actions. In hindsight, the situation had been motivated by political and social strife, and not by black magic at all. The events of the Massachusetts Bay Colony were formative to the development of the United States. Learning from the mistakes of theocracy taught our forefathers the importance of the separation of church and state. The witchcraft scare of the late 1600s showed us that due process of the law, as well as evidentiary processes, are a vital component to a just society. Despite the horrifying events that unfolded in Massachusetts, we can say that we learned from those terrors and moved forward to create a more fair and equitable society.
The Salem witch trials were a dark moment for New England, illustrating the dangers of runaway theocratic governments. As the decades passed, religious restrictions were gradually loosened in the colony, but many aspects of Puritan life endured for generations to come. Our 4th big idea today deals with the New England economy. New England's geographic features dictated economic activity there. The New England economy was more diverse and less dependent on unfree labor than in the Chesapeake. Okay, so this should sound a little familiar. Just like in the Chesapeake and southern regions, geography played a huge role in the development of the New England economy. And New England's geography differed greatly from the southern colonies, so naturally, economic activity looked quite different. Massachusetts and New England featured rocky soil, harsh winters, and short growing seasons. This ruled out cash crop agriculture. Instead, colonists in New England practiced subsistence farming, usually on smaller family farms. The forests of the Northeast provided a source of timber, which became an important natural resource in the area. The cool waters of the Atlantic made for great fishing, and the ports and shipyards in places like Boston gave rise to a vibrant shipping and shipbuilding industry. In short, while the economy of Virginia was one-dimensional, Massachusetts' economy was extremely diverse. Now, New England did feature unfree labor, but it was far less common than in the southern colonies. Plantation agriculture was not viable in Massachusetts, and slavery was not economical on smaller family farms. The few enslaved people who did live in Massachusetts usually worked in shipyards or as domestic servants. Because of the low numbers of enslaved people, attitudes towards slavery soured first in this region. Following the Revolutionary War, Massachusetts became the first U.S. state to abolish slavery completely. As was the case in the South, British colonists in New England clashed with Native Americans in the region. This is our final big idea. Initially friendly relations between New England colonists and Native Americans gave way to conflict over land. At the original New England colony at Plymouth, relationships between the Pilgrims and local Wampanoag were amicable and even symbiotic. Evidence of this is found in the story of the first Thanksgiving, which you probably know well. But as the New England colonies grew, relations with Native Americans followed a pattern that was similar to that of the South. Tension over land and trade routes spilled into war. Two such wars feature most prominently. The Pequot War was fought between 1636 and 1637. The Puritans were able to tip the scales in an intertribal conflict that actually predated their arrival. Puritan settlers allied with the Mohegan and Narragansett tribes against the Pequot, who had long controlled trade on the Hudson River and surrounding region. The result was devastating for the Pequot, whose members were massacred in a series of Puritan-led raids. The tribe was functionally eliminated as a threat to further British settlement in New England. A second major war began in 1675. Metacom's War, or as it was known by the British, King Philip's War, pitted the New England colonists and their allies, the Mohegans and Mohawks, against a confederacy of native tribes led by the Wampanoag, the same tribe that had shared in the celebration of the first Thanksgiving only decades earlier. The conflict was a humanitarian disaster. Per capita, it remains the deadliest war in American history. The defeat of Metacom and the Wampanoag, though it briefly halted the New England economy, cleared the way for the British to expand into southern New England. European land hunger was a constant in early British colonial history. And indeed, the pattern of pushing Native Americans off desired lands was only just beginning. Before we conclude, let's take a final look at the big question. Does a close relationship between church and state lead to a more moral society? There can be no denying the close relationship between religion and government in the Massachusetts colony. And some positives certainly emerged as a result. Religion drove the Puritans' community-first mindset. Puritans valued literacy and education for boys and girls. The Puritans were by and large law-abiding, and covenant theology drove them to become excellent workers. Their colony thrived as a result. On the other hand, Massachusetts also demonstrates the pitfalls of theocracy. Free speech was tightly restricted. Freedom of religion was non-existent. The religious government invaded the private lives of the colony settlers and handed down punishments we would now consider inhumane. Religious fanaticism and paranoia overcame reason and justice during the Salem witch trials. And despite the Puritans' Christian sensibilities, they committed atrocities against the Native Americans with whom they warred. When the first Congress of the United States ratified the First Amendment, they forbade the establishment of any religion by the U.S. government, thus creating a clear separation of church and state. Though they acknowledged the Protestant tradition in the British colonies, they recognized that religious doctrine was not always compatible with the principles of freedom and democracy, for which the Revolutionary War was ultimately fought. Yet, the discussion on religion continues, and your generation is ultimately faced with the decision of whether to renew or reject these founding principles. Next time, we'll round out our tour of British North America by taking a look at the Middle Colonies. See you then.